Hi, I'm Sam Nutt. I'm a medical doctor, published author, and the founder and president of War Child Canada, and I am ready to start digging deep.
I'm Mark Sutcliffe, and I'm on a quest to learn from the best. Welcome to Digging Deep, presented by Zen Books and Abacus Data. On Digging Deep, we seek out people with really powerful stories and lessons to share about life and leadership. On this episode, physician, philanthropist, and the founder of War Child Canada, Samantha Nutt. So in 1995, as a young doctor, Samantha Nutt traveled to Somalia as a volunteer with UNICEF. And what she witnessed there led her to what has now become a lifelong mission to help women and children in countries that are ravaged by war. Just a few years after going to Somalia, Sam founded War Child Canada, and she later founded War Child USA. And now, War Child supports 600,000 children and their families living in war zones. Now, there are many organizations that provide aid and support to developing countries, but Sam has witnessed how good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. In fact, a lot of the money that people donate doesn't end up being used in the most effective way possible. As Sam puts it, sometimes people who think they have all the answers actually become part of the problem. So War Child takes a very different approach, and as a result, they have much bigger impact. As one example, they hire local people rather than bring in outsiders to do the development work. In our conversation with Sam, we talk about a lot of different things, about leadership without assumptions, about fearlessness, about being a disruptive force, and about being open to opportunities. We talk about how Sam's ultimate mission picked her as much as she picked it. We talk about how she manages to do everything in her life, working as a doctor, leading War Child Canada, and also having a family. We also talk about what it's been like for Sam to go to many war-ravaged countries to provide medical aid, what it's been like for her building an organization in Canada and the United States. Sam also shares some incredibly moving and heart-wrenching stories, including the tragic story of what happened when she met a woman in line for medical care in Somalia, and also why she tried to mislead her parents about where she was actually going in Africa so they wouldn't worry about her. I think you will be really, really moved and inspired by Sam's passion and her thoughtfulness. But I will tell you, it's not all deadly serious, despite the work that she does. We also have a lot of fun talking about Sam's childhood and the time that she met one of her heroes, author Margaret Atwood. That's a pretty funny story. All right, one last thing before we get started. If you like what you hear, I'd really appreciate your support. Please subscribe to Digging Deep and post a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, and share this podcast with your network so other people can hear it as well. And if you're looking for more information, please go to letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. Now, let's start digging deep with doctor, author, humanitarian, and the founder of War Child, Samantha Nutt. Well, Sam, it is such a pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. And you and I met a few years back when you wrote your book, and I was so incredibly impressed by and inspired by the work that you do. And I'm really excited to talk about that work and ask you, some questions about what we can all do to make the world a better place, because that's really at the heart of your life's work. So thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for asking me, Mark. I'm looking forward to it.
So let's start by getting to know you a little bit better, and we'll start with your childhood. What is your fondest childhood memory?
I think that would be the birth of my sister when I was 7, almost 8 years of age. And I remember Miss Dixon, my grade 3 teacher, pulling me out of class and saying, "Your mother's in hospital. She's okay. You now have a baby sister." And I think at the time I turned around and said, well, that's good, because if it was a baby brother, I was sending it back. But my sister is still a huge influence in my life, and one of the one of the people I'm closest to, and I just am so grateful for her every day.
Oh, that's sweet. Who was your hero when you were 10 years old?
That would be a toss-up between Wonder Woman and Sabrina from Charlie's Angels.
Okay.
I'm a product of the 70s.
Yeah. Was Sabrina the Kate Jackson character?
No, she was the other one. She was the other brunette on the show. Actress whose name I've now forgotten.
Okay.
I'd have to look it up for you.
Okay. But you were obviously action oriented if it was Wonder Woman and Charlie's Angels. Yeah.
I guess so.
Yeah. And what did you think you were going to be when you grew up?
I probably Aquaman. I wouldn't say it was a well-conceived plan. Sticking with the superhero themes, maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
I did at one point think I was going to be an Olympic figure skater, but I get terrible motion sickness. So I would spin and then fall over. So I guess that was almost as unlikely as me being Aquaman.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There are some things that get in the way of Olympic dreams sometimes. Really practical things.
I don't think figure skaters who vomit all over themselves midway through the routine quite qualify.
Yeah. What would you say is your life story in 6 words?
Well, my high school report card, there is a summary at the bottom, and I think it's still my life story. It's a little bit more than 6 words, but they wrote, Samantha is a disruptive force in a sound environment.
Okay. And that's okay. I'm just thinking about that and wondering, so is that
a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah. From the perspective of a high school yearbook entry, did you say yearbook or report card? A report card. Yeah. Yes. So this is a teacher writing this?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So how did you take that?
Well, I mean, it came in the same report card that said Samantha is totally incapable of understanding physics. So on balance, it wasn't a stellar performance on my part, but I do remember arguing with my parents for quite a long period of time that being a disruptive force in a sound environment was perfectly appropriate and acceptable. Yeah.
Well, I think they nailed it though, didn't they? I mean, if you think about everything you've done since then.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think it's kind of funny because at the time I was kind of resentful. I felt that it was a bit of an authoritarian position to take, and definitely I was the kid who was more inclined to challenge at every conceivable opportunity. But I do think the sort of fearlessness that I have had most of my life when it comes to confronting what I believe to be unfair or atrocious or inequitable or any of those things, I think that I don't know, persistence was obviously present when I was younger, and now I do think it's a good thing. So it was something that I was embarrassed about when I was younger, and I suppose it's a bit of a mantle I now have with some pride.
Okay. For what do you feel most grateful?
Oh, my family and friends, the people who love me. They are my my constant comfort and my rock, and I wouldn't exist without them. They're just amazing.
And you say that even after having spent a ton of time with them over the last year. That's a good sign.
No, I mean, some days not so much, but on balance,
yeah,
it also makes you appreciate them more.
Of course. Yeah. What's been the best year of your life so far and why?
That's a tough one to choose. I hope that some of the best years are still ahead of me. I would definitely say the year 2000, which was when I married my husband, Eric. And also that was when we officially launched War Child Canada with the Tragically Hip at the Forks in Winnipeg with 80,000 Manitobans and raised over $300,000. And with Gord Downey, which was just an amazing day, an amazing event. And I still think of that very, very fondly. And also the birth of our son in 2005, Reese, was really important. I didn't put that first because when you have an infant, it's also a year that's very much a blur. And there are parts of it that you just remember how exhausted and terrifying the whole thing was. And so, but definitely those were 2 landmark years in our house.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to say it's the best year of your life when you only sleep like 3 hours a night.
Yeah, that's right. And when you have a kid who's screaming all the time.
Yeah. What's been the toughest year of your life so far?
That would definitely be 2018. My father passed away very, very suddenly at 75, the day after New Year's, and we were all away at the time, and we had to try to get back in the middle of a rainstorm. It felt like sort of a bit of a mini hurricane. but the sudden nature of it was really terrible, and it was very difficult for the whole family, for my mom in particular. And so it was a really challenging year. We also had some health issues that we were dealing with in terms of our own family, and felt like it was there was a lot of heaviness that year. And it's certainly, the pandemic has been tough, but even in the context of the pandemic, I think 2018 was the most challenging that I've had to face this far.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear that. What one person would you say has had the greatest impact on your life?
My husband, without a doubt. We have been together for more than half of my life, for 27 years. And we met through McMaster University, and we met because of our shared love of global health and international humanitarian aid and human rights. And we pursued that passion and that dream and that vision together at every step of the way. And and still he's my partner in every sense of the word. He's the person I turn to the most for everything. And time hasn't dampened that extraordinary love and devotion that I have for him. So I would say my husband, absolutely.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing
well, now
that.
I have to make him listen to this.
Yeah. This can be your
honey,
next.
I told you I still love you.
Yeah. Happy birthday. There,
Happy
I didn't buy you a gift.
And Father's Day. There it is.
What's the most important lesson you've learned? And you've had so many incredible experiences in your life, and different experiences from what most people living in North America have lived. What's the most important lesson you share with other people?
That would be to never, ever hesitate to let those, and to demonstrate to those you love just how much you truly mean it, because time doesn't always afford you that luxury. And I knew that before my father passed away. I certainly know that now even more so. But there are so many instances in my life where I've been, particularly in my friends in Iraq and other environments, where I didn't have any sense that this would be the last time I saw them. And then it was. And again, it's not a question of living with regret, but knowing that you let those people know how much you valued them and how important they were to your life, while you could, and when they could hear it directly from you. That's something that I try to do all the time now. I don't want to squander those opportunities, because you just don't know when they're going to happen again.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely valuable lesson. And as becomes even more important as you get older, obviously, right? As you realize there isn't just this sort of infinite runway ahead of you and ahead of all the other people in your life, right?
Well, that's it. And I also think that there's something to be said for really thanking the people who have been instrumental in your life, who have helped you get to where you are, to become who you are, who you may not even be in touch with now, but who were so critical at different stages of your life, that enabled you to achieve and to realize all your potential. And I think of even some of the teachers that I had growing up, fantastic women, Susan Dowswell, Mary Lowry, my English teachers, my drama teachers, they stuck me on a stage at 13, 14 when I had headgear and train tracks and the whole thing, and didn't even audition because I was too scared and too embarrassed and didn't think that I was capable. And they did, they just said, well, here you go. And we've cast you in these parts. And it forced me to confront some of my fears, but in a very supportive way. And I think about people like that if they hadn't come into my life, how it might have been very different, how I may never have seized those opportunities to share, to speak my mind and share my ideas. And we all need people to believe in us. And more importantly, we also need to acknowledge and thank those people, because they are, we wouldn't make it without them.
Yeah, that's so true. So what would people be most surprised to learn about you?
I think that I think the perception is, because I do heavy work in war zones and consider myself a human rights activist, that I'm very serious all the time. And I think what surprises a lot of people who don't know me, but one of the things that my friends are always sort of commenting, is that I'm actually fairly lighthearted and usually funny more often than I am serious, and laugh more than I'm, negative or down in a room. Like people, I think, would automatically presume I'm going to walk into a dinner party and just be the voice of doom and gloom, and not realize that I'm usually the one who's like cracking jokes and being ridiculous and self-deprecating. And so I think that's probably something people are genuinely surprised by. Even some media folks will send me like emails asking for my commentary, and it usually comes back and it's laced with like sidebar comments, maybe a little bit of profanity or whatever it is. And they go, wow, you are nothing like what we thought you were like.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's, you know, in a way that I'm not surprised you have that, that there is that expectation about you, right? Because of the serious nature of what you talk about, that everybody thinks you're just going to be going on and on about, you know, all the awful things that are happening in the world instead
Negative
of
and depressing things.
Yeah.
Please
Yeah.
invite me to dinner. I'm not that depressing.
Yeah, exactly. What would you say is your secret talent?
I knit.
Okay. Like what kind of stuff?
Oh, everything.
Scarves,
sweaters, like everything. I like to knit. It's very mindful. Because in my previous life before COVID, used to travel all the time and was at an airport 20 out of 30 days and snowed in sometimes or delayed for hours on end. And you just find yourself getting so irritated and frustrated. And so I started to knit, and so that I could sit for 10 hours waiting for an airplane and not be filled with resentment and rage. And it's been very productive. It's been a very mindful, purposeful, useful thing. But also what I love about it is it gives you a chance to give things to people that you made. And so it's very, very special and very, I think, sentimental in a way, but it's really nice to acknowledge those you care about with gifts that you made. So. Yeah,
that's wonderful. But, you know, I'm just sort of trying to picture you sitting in some, you know, foreign airport somewhere in Africa or something like that. And, you know, and the world's falling apart, and you've just been on this, you know, this mission to help other people and seen all these, you know, sometimes inspiring, but sometimes very disturbing things. And then you're just there like making a scarf. That's kind of.
Yeah, I know. And there I am, or knitting a sock or whatever it is. And I have people that travel with me, including board members, and will be actually in an airport in Iraq, or, you know, and they'll look at me and they'll go, I can't even process that. So,
that's great. There's something
you asked for something surprising. There you go. I delivered something surprising.
Very nice. Yeah, that's a good one. What's the most fun you've ever had?
Oh, we've had a lot of fun. You know, we have a very small family cabin up near Haliburton, sort of up near Algonquin on a no motor lake. And we have friends and family, pre-COVID this is, that spend a lot of time with us up there, and we drink wine and we laugh and we play stupid board games, and always for me, that is where I have the most fun. That is the place where I am the most happiest. Being surrounded by those that you can laugh with and that you love and that you enjoy is tremendous. That to me is always the happiest time.
Nice. Now, I normally ask what's the scariest thing you've ever done, but I think I'm going to save that question because, well, and yeah, and I mean, it's part of the bigger story we're going to get into of some of the experiences you've had. So I'll park that one for now. But what would be your boldest prediction for the future?
I would say that war can be solved in our lifetime.
Really?
I do think that. I mean, I see what causes conflict. And I see how many opportunities exist for us to invest in peace instead. And I think that if we prioritize those investments in peace, and in particular in greater gender equality and protecting the vulnerable, in prioritizing people's rights and opportunities over our ongoing militarism, that peace is a realistic goal. It's an achievable goal. Whether we actually get there or not depends on the decisions that we take. And so those are the constraints, but it can be.
Let's come back to that, because that obviously is, that's the direction and the mission of your work ultimately. So if you were speaking to a group of students today, what would be the message of your commencement address?
Well, I've done quite a few of those. And I think ultimately what I would say is that who you are now is going to change. It's going to evolve. You have no idea what you will ultimately be capable of. Your degree is an opportunity. It's a ticket to enter, but it doesn't define you. There's a whole world out there of things that you can do and become and take advantage of those opportunities by remaining open and curious. And the other thing I would say, especially if I was talking to myself at that age, is, you may not think that you're brave, but you are. There will be times when you want to give up, but don't, because better days lie ahead. And I've reflected on that a fair bit during the pandemic as well. We need to remember that it is going to get better, and sometimes that's hard.
That's a great message. Is there anything about which you've had a recent epiphany, something you've discovered, or something about which you've changed your mind?
I think over the past year of lockdown, I've learned that I don't have to be as busy, that you don't have to fill every single day down to the very last minute for it to be purposeful and for you to feel as if you've contributed. Sometimes you do need to just take the space to reflect and to be present in the lives of other people, and to not necessarily be thinking about the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. We spend so much of our lives chasing success and focusing on our careers and our accomplishments and these kinds of things. And then you take something like this where we're all in this state of suspended animation. I guess the New York Times writer called it the state of languishing, right? In that now widely circulated article. And when those moments happen, you realize that oftentimes the things we chase every day are a distraction. And the most important things are all around us, right around us. It's our family, it's our friends, and taking care of one another is probably the most important goal and ambition we should have every day. Now it sounds like I've gone a bit new age. I am not. Maybe I'm just,
Yeah.
I still can't do yoga. Still don't have the attention span to do yoga. No.
Yeah, that would have been the next question. Yeah.
No, yoga stresses me out.
Yoga stresses you out. I don't think it's supposed to do that.
It does, it does.
You must not be doing it right.
No, because I always think if I'm going to exercise, I should exercise to the point of complete physical exhaustion. And if I'm not getting that from my exercise, then it actually stresses me out. I always think about the other things I should be doing instead of downward dog. I'm a terrible yoga person. Terrible.
Yeah, I've got that problem too. It's too much time for your mind to wander for me, but it's interesting, the point you just made about how the pandemic sort of reminds us of what's really important, and we've all had that opportunity. And what I fear, there's an episode of The Simpsons where Homer almost dies from eating this raw fish or something. And then he promises, he swears he's going to cherish every moment from that point forward. And then it cuts to a scene of him sitting on the couch watching bowling on television. And I feel like we're all going to do that when the pandemic's over, right? We're all just going to, we're all going to make this pledge like, our lives are never, we're never going to take anything for granted ever again. And we're going to be good to the people and spend all this time together and all that. And then we're just going to go right back to the crazy, busy existences we had in 2019.
Yeah, I mean that's the risk, right? And and I think for a period of time that's understandable too, right? That we are going to go through this phase when all of these lockdowns are lifted and everything else, where you just have to do everything at once. You have to go to 16 patios in one evening and take 20 different flights somewhere and have 30 different restaurant meals and go shopping just because you haven't been in a store in a million years. But so I think there will be some of that, but I don't know. I do think this has been a year of taking stock, and no matter what happens from my perspective, the process of going through that I think it's left me changed in some important ways, and maybe a little lacking in ambition, maybe a little lazier than I was in 2019 when this all started. Now it's a big day if I have to shower, so your yardstick changes, right?
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, that was a busy day. I had to shower, but but who knows? We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Sam, is there a book that you are, other than your own book, of course, that you're most likely to recommend to or share with others?
I often recommend people who are interested in humanitarian aid and the history of colonialism and examples of how it has created structural and generational inequalities and contributed to conflict and violence and instability. I often recommend King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, which I think is an excellent read. A lot of footnotes. I recommend that there's a whole second book in the footnotes. So I always say to people, take the time to read the footnotes because they're dense but rich with material. And so for me, it explores the legacy of Belgian colonialism in the Congo. And explains, and it really ties very directly to the now almost 20 years of conflict that they're still going through in that part of the world. So, and again, it also points to the ways in which we are often unwittingly implicated in the suffering of other human beings. And so I think it's a very good book. It's a very gripping book, and historically extremely accurate. So it's one that I'm very fond of, and always recommend to students that they pick up and read.
All right. Great. Thank you for that recommendation. Thank you for answering all those questions. That was a lot of fun and very inspiring and illuminating. So we're going to take a short pause, and then we are going to continue digging deep with Dr. Samantha Nutt. We're just going to take a quick break so I can tell you a little bit more about the presenting sponsor of Digging Deep, ZenBooks. ZenBooks is Canada's go-to cloud accounting firm. They are not your typical accounting firm. I know the founders, Colin and Eric. I've worked with them for several years. And here's why I think you should consider working with them too. First of all, they bring a fresh, unique, modern approach to what is a very old-fashioned industry. These guys were working remotely and in the cloud long before it became cool. ZenBooks also uses technology to your advantage. I think this is really important. They give you the tools and analysis you need to monitor your business in real time. That's so valuable right now when everything changes so quickly. Yes, they're a virtual accounting firm, but that doesn't mean they're offshore, and it doesn't mean they're inattentive. ZenBooks combines the efficiency and effectiveness of a cloud accounting service with all the benefits that you'd want from a trusted advisor, high-level advice, and strategic support. Now, here's what I think is going to happen if you work with ZenBooks. You'll probably start out taking advantage of their cutting-edge cloud accounting solutions, but in the long run, I think you'll stay with them because of their strategic guidance and problem solving. Among their core values, they specifically list being candid and proactive. Isn't that exactly what you want from a trusted advisor? Look, even if you're already working with an accountant or a bookkeeper, or you have some accounting staff on your team, I think you should still talk to ZenBooks and learn more about their tools and their expertise. Check out ZenBooks at zenbooks.ca. That's zenbooks.ca. Digging Deep is all about helping you make better decisions, and so is Abacus Data. Most leaders struggle to connect with and engage their audiences. Why is that? It's because they aren't sure how they think and feel and how they will react. Abacus Data can give you the strategic insights you need to make better decisions and to make them confidently. Here's a good example. A major national union was recently negotiating a new agreement for its thousands of members. This had the potential to be a very difficult process. There were many competing interests. So they brought in Abacus Data to conduct thorough and detailed research of their members to learn exactly where they stood, what they were thinking, what they wanted. And as a result, they were able to secure a strong new deal that was accepted overwhelmingly in a national vote. Abacus Data helps all of its clients understand what's really happening in the minds of their employees, clients, and stakeholders. They help them avoid costly blind spots. And they're really good at what they do. In fact, Abacus Data was one of the most accurate pollsters in the 2019 Canadian federal election. Make the one decision that will improve all of your other decisions. Let Abacus Data help you move forward with confidence and clarity. Go to abacusdata.ca. That's abacusdata.ca. Sam, once again, thank you for being with us today. I'm really excited to dig into your story more and the work that you do. And I understand that when you were a high school student, you decided to raise money for famine relief in Ethiopia. And that's kind of perhaps where this whole story began. Was that connected to sort of the Live Aid movement at the time? Was it around the same time as that?
It was, yeah, it was around the same time as that. I mean, that was part of it. I always say it's never one thing, but it's a series of things. And the truth is that I had spent time growing up overseas in different parts of the world, in Brazil and South Africa and elsewhere. And then when I was a university student, I got very heavily involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And then moving on from there, also started looking at issues around Indigenous health and well-being as a medical student, and then applied to do my master's degree in public health in developing countries in England at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So that was my public health degree, and that's what took me to Somalia. So it was kind of, you looking back, you sort of say, well, there was this arc that was in motion, but it was not. I would not say it was one very specific thing. It was a series of things. And if you had said to me when I was 14 that someday I would find myself being a doctor and working in different war zones, I would have thought that was extremely unlikely. I was not somebody who was craving danger or adventure or anything along those lines, as some people who end up in this field are, and I'm still not like that. So it's one of those things where I ended up doing this work. And once I had been exposed to the atrocities of war, I was profoundly changed as a human being, and could no longer go back to pretending that these things weren't happening in the world. So it picked me in a way.
Yeah, but why? When it picked you, why did you answer? I guess because obviously everybody's aware. I mean, we don't all get to see it firsthand like you have, but everybody's aware of these challenges in the world, and I think a lot of people, for practical and even emotional reasons, just sort of block it out, or they can't go there, or whatever. But you answered the call. Why do you think that is?
I was always interested in the intersection between women's health and women's rights, and specifically looking at the impact of violence on women and girls especially. And so I ended up, and that was also why when I was applying for my residency, graduating from medical school, I had asked to work at Women's College Hospital, and I'm still on staff at Women's College Hospital in Toronto, because I do have a strong interest in and belief in the importance of women's health, and understanding again those connections between sort of violence and women's health and conflict and everything else. And so with that in mind, I was recruited to work with UNICEF in Somalia in the early 90s while I was doing my master's degree, because again, there was conflict, because there was a huge women's health component to what they were looking at from a maternal and child health point of view. And so that was how I ended up, the opportunity came about, and I jumped at the opportunity because it fell right into what I was interested in. The fact that it was in a conflict affected area, it sounds sort of stupid to say this but at the time, I mean, to me, it was more about this sort of conflict piece, the violence piece in women, as opposed to, I'm going to go be a doctor in a war zone. That wasn't what it was for me. It was something else.
Yeah.
I don't know if I've explained that properly. You might have to edit all around that.
No, that makes sense. And you don't always, especially at a young age, have this big specific direction in mind. You just sort of step into a space and then it leads you to the next space, and you keep going from there, right?
Exactly. And if you're curious about
Yeah.
the world, and if you're open to opportunities that come to you, I never really had a grand plan. I'm not somebody who plans that far ahead. I'm not somebody who said, well, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to be, I'm going to go to do this residency, and then I'm going to have an academic teaching appointment, and I'm going to, that, and like, that was never me. I was just always, if it was interesting, if I was curious about it, if it was an issue involving human rights or the rights of women, anti-oppression, that kind of stuff, I naturally gravitated towards that, and each opportunity led to a different opportunity and a different way of seeing the world and seeing the problem.
So you got recruited by UNICEF to go to Somalia, and am I right that you lied to your parents about that? Is that right?
It was appalling. It was appalling. Now that I have a 16-year-old son, I would never, ever, ever recommend anything along these lines. But no, I knew that they would worry. And I was doing my master's degree in the UK. And then I got this opportunity to work in Somalia. And I ended up being, I didn't want to tell them I was heading into a war zone, because I knew that they would, be really upset and worried. And so what I did was I was at the airport in Nairobi, and I bought about, a couple dozen postcards, and I wrote on them, because I had told them I was going on safari, actually, an extended safari, so I won't be reachable. And then what I did was I post dated all of these postcards and wrote little messages and, having a good time, et cetera, et cetera. And then I asked the woman at the airport to mail them every couple of weeks. And again, it's now that I'm a parent, this is just shameful and awful.
I love this story. I mean, this is, it's one thing to forge your mom's signature on a test or something like that, but you created a whole series of fake postcards. And you engaged somebody who worked at the airport in Nairobi as your accomplice in this to send them out at regular intervals to deceive your parents into thinking you were in Kenya.
That's right. Yeah, I actually paid her some money to do this for me. Again, it was awful, and so they did this. But the only problem was, she, understandably, because she knew that I wasn't coming back, she just put them all in the post at the same time. So then all of a sudden, my parents received. My mother still, I don't think, has forgiven me for that transgression, and nor should she. It was awful. Yes. Don't do that. Don't do that, kids, ever, to your parents. It's the worst thing to do.
Yeah. And of course, you couldn't do it now anyway, because who sends postcards anymore in this digital age?
Postcards. Nobody sends postcards. Although we have been in other situations where things have been quite heated, and I would pop up and send an email to my mother saying, "Oh, everything's fine. We're okay." But when it was certainly not the case. But it's tough. I don't think. My parents certainly wouldn't have wanted me to do what I ultimately ended up doing, and nor would I want my son to do what I ultimately have been doing. Yeah. But sometimes these things choose you, right?
Yep. Yeah. What parent would want their daughter to go into a war zone, no matter how much they might respect the work that you would be doing, right? Yeah, that's understandable. So tell me about the experience in Somalia. And I read something about what you experienced not long after you arrived there, I think, where you were talking to a woman who was in line for healthcare, and she had a child in her arms. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think for me, this was one of the hardest moments I've had doing this kind of work. But it was also one that I think led me to an epiphany of sorts at that time around the role of humanitarian aid and humanitarian action and its limitations, and the ways in which we can often be unwittingly implicated in the suffering of other human beings, and at the same time, around humanitarian aid, delude ourselves into believing that we're there and that we're we're doing the right things, and that's not always the case. And so for me, in that particular situation, as I was saying, I was tasked by UNICEF to be part of this maternal and child health evaluation team to look at, this was right on the heels of the Rwandan genocide. And so Somalia had gone from having about 140 international organizations to having fewer than 40 operating in the country. And they had been, Somalia still was a failed state, right? And so they were responsible for all aspects of the healthcare infrastructure, all of these external actors, because there wasn't any government infrastructure there at the time. And so because of this mass exodus of organizations, everything had just, stopped. And so the question then became, well, what do you prioritize? How do you proceed? What do you do in the face of limited resources? And so these are some of the questions that our team was addressing. And I was working with a local Somali midwife by the name of Miriam, who is amazing. And so we would often go together and take stock of these maternal and child health centers. And one afternoon, we ended up at a UNICEF-supported feeding clinic, and there's a long line of women who were holding their infants who were waiting to be seen, to be treated. And I was doing my survey and taking my inventory and talking to women in line and working with Miriam, and we were translating, and she was translating. And then this one woman, I was talking to her about 20 minutes about her healthcare and her infant's needs and everything else. I reached forward and I tried to put my finger in the palm of her baby's hand. And when I did that, I realized, 20 minutes into this conversation, that the baby she was holding was already deceased, was in rigor, and had, was cold and lifeless, and had clearly succumbed to malnutrition and dehydration many hours before. And yet here she was standing in line at this UNICEF clinic. And I found out later on that she had been detained for several days by some young men armed with Kalashnikov rifles who were essentially trying to extort her for more money as her baby was dying of malnutrition and cholera. And the reason why she was standing in line that day was because she no longer had the funding, the money that she needed to be able to pay to go back home to her village to bury her child. And in that moment, is seeing and recognizing and feeling very much, her grief and her sadness and her loss. I was also filled with so much rage, that here is a situation where young men with guns could inflict such enormous suffering in a part of the world where those guns at that moment in time were more readily available and accessible than clean drinking water, where kids were dying because of that tainted water. And how so much of what we were doing as this kind of humanitarian infrastructure apparatus was missing the mark entirely. We were trying to provide resources to people who desperately needed them, but the issues were so enormous and so entrenched that it rarely ever felt as if you were able to help those who needed it the most.
Yeah, and maybe this is a good time to talk about that. First of all, that's a horrifying, really, it's just a really sad story, and I appreciate you sharing it, because I think it really illustrates some of the dynamics that you discovered and what likely motivated you to do all the things you've done since then. But I think one of the challenges that you have really drawn attention to is that there's an instinct in all of us to do good when we discover that there are things wrong in the world. But sometimes the best of intentions don't lead to the best of outcomes. And a lot of humanitarian work that is done with the best of intentions doesn't really accomplish what it sets out to do, and is perhaps even part of an infrastructure that in some ways even sustains or perpetuates some of the dynamics, right? Why is that? Why are we kind of stuck in this cycle sometimes?
That is the $1 million question that I've been trying to answer for the past 25 years. And I did write about this in my book, and I provided some examples of that. And one of the chapters I ended with a line which I still believe in very strongly, which is only fools rush in believing they have all the answers without realizing how quickly they become part of the problem. And that's very true. There is one of the great, I think, lies really about humanitarianism and humanitarian action that we perpetuate, that we unwittingly often perpetuate. There is that these are communities that are waiting for foreign countries, for foreign individuals to come in and to save them and to rescue them. And that simply isn't true. There is tremendous capacity and courage and resiliency and skill and talent that exists within those communities. And the best interventions are the ones that empower them to do that work through skills training, through capacity building, through financial resources, through solidarity, through solidarity and action around human rights. That is the most important piece. And that's why, in terms of even War Child's operations throughout the world, War Child Canada, it's about 99% of our staff are local, including at the most senior country director level. And they are the ones who are directing the programs, designing the programs, identifying the priorities, and providing the necessary leadership. And I very much see our job, our role as humanitarian agents within that space to simply facilitate that work, to help make it possible, to fundraise for it, to make sure that it gets the right kind of platform, that it's understood, the importance of it is understood. We're in a secondary role to that great courage and that great work. And that's where I think a lot of humanitarian action misses the mark. And I think that that's where we might have terrific intentions, but we can do more harm than good. Even when we take our used t-shirts and put them in a drop box, and you can draw a line between those used t-shirts and the loss of hundreds of thousands of textile jobs in Africa, for example, because they end up as surplus goods flooding those local markets and putting local tailors and local community organizations out of business. And so we need to ask really critical questions about this. And I think that in particular has come to light over the past year, when we've looked at, some models of, for example, well-intended high school students paying to go overseas to paint a classroom or to read to orphans. We need to ask, is this the best way that we can contribute? Or is the better way for us to contribute to meaningfully invest in those local communities so that they have the resources and the tools and the opportunities to do that work themselves? And I'll say this to kids a lot who are really interested in international development work. And it's not applicable during the pandemic, but in other times it is. If you have the resources and the means to travel, by all means, go ahead and do it. There is a vast, wondrous world out there that you can learn from and absorb and bear witness to. I mean, it's all incredible stuff. But you can also just go and be a tourist and spend your money in local community cooperatives, local women's cooperatives. You don't need busy work philanthropy. You're contributing to their economy, and you're not taking jobs away from those on the ground. In fact, you may be creating jobs. So ask those hard questions around who benefits before you make those kinds of decisions.
Yeah, and I think there's something else here at play that I wanted to explore with you. And I was thinking of, there's an expression about how for every 1,000 people hacking at the branches of evil, there's 1,000 people hacking at the branches of evil for everyone who's hacking at the root. And I think there's also, unfortunately, and I don't want to be sort of, I include myself in this. I think there is a tendency for people to look for solutions that are too simple and to sort of tick a box saying, well, I did my part, and that the answers are really so complex and messy and complicated that most people don't have the inclination or the bandwidth to go there. So they would rather feel like, oh, I participated in this trip and we built a school, or I donated money to this thing, and so I've done my part, right? And do you feel like we all have to challenge ourselves to do more and to understand more?
I do. And I think it's also about just asking the right kinds of questions. and not leading from a place of assumption, right? So it's bringing that, again, that curiosity and that critical thinking. And I certainly don't have an expectation. I don't think anybody in the humanitarian space has the expectation that those who support the efforts are well versed in geopolitics and foreign policy and all this kind of stuff, and humanitarian aid and human rights law and all that. I mean, that's not the expectation, but certainly ask some fundamental questions, right? I mean, I would say ask what kind of model of aid, of humanitarian action the organization that you're interested in supporting endorses. You know, what percentage of their staff are local in those leadership roles? How do they make their programming decisions? Those are really good kinds of questions to ask, so that you know that what's being done is important, that it's an identified need, that it is being driven by the knowledge and the competencies of insiders instead of the assumptions of outsiders. That's really, really important. And the other thing I would say to people too is look, if you really want to make an impact, if you want to get at that root of the tree, as you talk about, it takes long-term investing. You know, it's not the case where you can make a donation once because you see a crisis in the news and then walk away and then ask yourself, well, why is it not getting any better in certain parts of the world? The truth is that if you really want to see your contributions become more effective, then you're much better off being a regular donor, like a monthly donor to an organization you believe in, because that does allow them to do the long-term work of economic development, of education, of protecting the rights of women and girls, of ending sexual and gender-based violence. Like, these are not things that get solved overnight. It takes no less than a generation to see the effects of well-managed aid. And so be in it for a longer period of time. And then you will be part of something that you'll see the impact of. It's amazing.
Yeah, that's a great point. The post-dated checks rather than just the one check, right? And in fact, we talked earlier about Live Aid. You know, it's funny because I can't remember. I was a teenager at the time, but I remember thinking, what happens after this is over, right? Like this is a one-time thing, and it was great. But it's, unless you're doing it every year, how are you solving, it? And again, unfortunately, I'm being a bit negative about humanity here, but it's like it sort of absolves people of, like, it feels like, well, we did our thing for Africa, so they're on their own now, right?
Yeah, and people can get quite cynical about that stuff. And it's interesting now. I mean, you look back at, because I think we're the same generation. You look back at Live Aid now, and there's so much of that was just so so cringy and colonial in terms of its thinking, and a lot of white savior complex stuff enmeshed in all of that, and a lot of the wrong kind of messaging. And I suppose at the time, the one good thing is it was drawing very much needed attention to a real crisis. But again, you've got such amazing local voices now that, thankfully, I mean, that is one of the good things of social media, that those voices have a much stronger platform, and it's nice to be able to hear directly from them and connect directly with them.
So while we're loading up on the guilt here for our society, another really important point that you raise often, I think, is the fact that sometimes people feel that war in other parts of the world is not our problem, but in fact we are complicit in it in a lot of ways, right? So can you talk more about that?
Yeah, and I gave the example as well of Somalia and the young men with Kalashnikov rifles. And if you look at, not just annual worldwide military spending, but if you look at the countries that are doing the biggest business around arms and military sales, it's the P5 plus Germany plus increasingly Spain, but it's those who are profiting from the sale and the transaction of that kind of military hardware in the world are, it's Russia, it's China, it's the United States, it's the UK, it's France, it's Germany, it's Spain, it's Canada. I mean, we know we have a multi-billion-dollar arms deal with Saudi Arabia still in play. So again, that's an example of the ways in which we are profiting from war, and that war is embedded in some of our teachers' pension funds, our publicly traded pension funds. The Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board still has $1 billion in various in companies that are involved in manufacturing arms and military hardware. So it's war is in everything we do every day. It's also in our cell phones and our computers and our video game consoles in the form of coltan, which is a mineral, a metal that is readily mined in the Eastern Congo and smuggled across borders, especially with Rwanda, and provides resources to continue fueling that war. And, I'm not suggesting that we have a ban on cell phones or anything by that sort of anything along those lines. But the truth is we should be asking critical questions, and we need to understand that war isn't something that happens external to who we are and how we live our lives. It's very much embedded in the geopolitical privilege that we occupy, and geopolitically privileged space that we occupy, I should say. And so I think that means that we also have an obligation, a responsibility to invest in those very things that strengthen opportunities within those environments for people to protect and uphold their rights, to realize their hopes and ambitions through things like education and economic development, and to decide the future of their countries in ways that are fairer and more transparent and more democratic.
So do you ever feel any kind of guilt? Because when I become more and more aware of these kinds of things, and even when I'm aware of things that are happening in our country or even in the city where I live, I sometimes ask myself how I can, have all the nice things I have in my life and the food I have and or how I can sit in front of the TV and watch Netflix or a baseball game when all of this other stuff is going on in the world. And I wonder how you manage to do that, having even more awareness than I do and than most people do. Like, how do you, how do you balance that heavy stuff in your life with still having, a life, a family, a North American existence?
Mark, sometimes it's tough, and I won't deny, especially when I was younger, there were times when I would have been working overseas for quite a long period of time and then come home and then people are complaining about things that I would consider to be utterly ridiculous, like a line at the bank and somebody's having a meltdown and then I would confront them and say, well, don't you know that this is happening in the world, right? And then you sort of realize you've become a self-righteous pain in the ass. And people stop inviting you over. and then at that point you think, is it me or is it them? Well, maybe it's me. And and you have to, tone it down. But the reality is, look, I think that what's important is that we find ways that we can contribute, and we find ways that we can give. And we shouldn't allow, I think, the sense of dislocation or guilt that we feel to paralyze us and to stop us from doing something meaningful to address it, right? Because that's what can happen, is you can just kind of think that it's easier not to deal with it at all because it raises too many questions, and it makes people feel, just, I don't know, that they just don't even know where to start, right? So for me in my life, I would say what I feel more than anything now is grateful. Like I'm so grateful to fall asleep and to not have bombs dropping all around me, or to not hear the staccato of automatic gunfire. I'm grateful for that, and I don't take it for granted. And I also understand that that piece of security is fleeting. It all of it is fleeting. Even I think we've learned a little bit of that lesson during the pandemic as well. All those things that we took for granted, getting up every day, going someplace to work, going someplace to dinner, going someplace on the subway. I mean, all of these kinds of things that suddenly became dangerous or were not available to us. It it, we have to appreciate what we've got, and understand that the what's being asked of us is that we try to ensure that others have those opportunities as well.
So I'm interested in your experience through all of this, though, and I, as I mentioned earlier, I skipped the question about the scariest thing you've ever done. You've obviously been involved in some very dangerous situations, and were there times when you feared for your life, when you were scared? Have you been through moments like that?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we were trapped pretty much on the front line in the Eastern Congo, which I did write about in Damnations, and with our team, and we were very lucky to have gotten out of that in one piece. And although it was really touch and go, I mean, we were bunkered down in a basement room with bombs dropping around us, and hundreds of thousands of rounds went off in about 1 to 2 days. So that was very scary. I've certainly been threatened with violence on a number of occasions. I've had my fill of having to deal with guys in military fatigues with mirrored glasses who are extremely threatening, physically threatening, and in every way, especially as a woman.
Yeah.
I've also had my fair share of car ambushes, including heading into Baghdad in 2003 from Jordan, and also in Kenya on my way to the airport after coming out of Burundi. So look, there are times when this work is scary, and you go into a war zone, and even if you're not careening towards the front line can land right on top of you. But I also still see that as just a fraction of the fear and the threats that our local staff face every day, that people living within those environments, civilians living with those environments, women and children endure every single day. And so I use those examples in my own life as a reason for why I need to get up and keep doing what I do, because I at least have had the good fortune of being able to come home and feel safe and feel secure and ready myself to re-engage with this kind of work and these kinds of issues. But the vast majority of people we work with don't have those opportunities or those luxuries.
I'm interested in hearing about how you built War Child Canada and then War Child USA, and what you've learned about growing and leading an organization like that. I mean, you could have chosen to volunteer, you could have chosen to do some things, but you decided to launch something pretty significant. And tell me what that experience has been like of creating and building an organization to address these issues.
I think when you start anything new, it's always challenging. It always comes with big questions around sort of why and who do you think you are, and why are you doing this, and everything else. Look, I think for me, having worked with different international organizations off and on over the span of 5 years, particularly when I was younger, I really recognized that there was this huge gap that was present in every conflict affected place that I was working in, that where you had women and children who had longer term needs, who were facing enormous structural deficits, structural challenges in terms of their participation and being able to uphold and protect their rights. And that a lot of humanitarian organizations, understandably, were doing a great job of focusing on people's short-term needs in order to keep them alive. So food and water and shelter and blankets. But those longer-term needs were often the domain of development organizations that weren't present in these sort of high-risk environments. So issues of education, access to justice, rights protection, sexual and gender-based violence work, economic development. And yet, without engaging in those things, the cycle just continued. The cycle of poverty, of violence, of despair, of anguish. People were not able to recover, and they weren't able to rebuild their communities. And so you were seeing a lot of aid dependency in those environments. And so and I'm a public health doctor. So for me, it's always about well, what is the evidence, and where, what kind of intervention is going to maximally benefit the large number of people, and what does that look like, and how do we facilitate a change in the circumstances of people's lives? Like, it's not up to us to change those circumstances, but how can we nurture different outcomes by doing things differently, right, in an evidence-based fashion? And so the pursuit of that is really what led to the evolution of war child's programs throughout the world. But it was tough, and we're still not huge. We're about a $20 million a year organization in this country. We support and help about 600,000 children and their families every single year. So we do a lot with not a huge amount of money.
Wow.
But I still often feel that we are the underdogs. We're always trying to prove and justify our existence, and we don't have millions of dollars to throw towards big advertising campaigns. We rely on, I would say, a fairly sophisticated group of donors who seek us out and who have, I think, a fairly robust understanding of international aid and humanitarian assistance, and they like what we do, and they like why we do it, and they want to get behind that vision. And so, it's still tough. Every day is still tough, but I do believe, and I've seen the impact of it. I certainly believe very strongly in what we're doing and the models that we deploy, and we see the impact.
You mentioned some of the risks that you confronted as a woman in other parts of the world. What's the experience been like as a woman building a not-for-profit organization in Canada and the United States? Because I imagine you've encountered some challenges around that along the way.
Yeah, that is a long conversation. Long conversation that may involve a bottle of wine. Look, it's tough, and I wouldn't presume that my experience is any different from any other woman leader out there, and those who identify as women. It's a struggle sometimes to be heard. It's a struggle to be taken seriously. You're constantly having to prove yourself and define your space, and confront assumptions around who is an expert, who is allowed to speak, whose opinions are valid. I mean, these are things that that a lot of us deal with, right? It's I don't know. I mean, I just think the only way that you can push back against that stuff is just to be really stubbornly persistent, and to show that you're not going to go away, and build alliances and build networks of people who are like-minded. I think that makes a big difference.
There must have been many moments along the way where I'm sure you faced tons of challenges. I'm sure, like any organization and like any leader, you've made lots of mistakes and learned from them. But are there any moments that come to mind where you felt like this proves that I'm doing the right thing here and that we're making a difference, where that became tangible for you?
Yeah, and I've had so many great examples of that, right? Well, and you mentioned the issue of sexual and gender-based violence in Eastern Congo and girls being held back from school, for example. And so we launched a couple of years ago an effort to try to reach those girls in particular. So these are communities where there was such high rates of sexual and gender-based violence that they either weren't able to access school, or they're being held back from school, or the school simply didn't exist. And in many cases, they were being forced into, various sort of labor roles, or else early child marriage. And so we worked with the Congolese Ministry of Education. We worked with local educators, local teachers, and produced and accelerated a catch-up learning curriculum that we then recorded to be dispatched over radio. And so we deployed teaching assistants to those communities. They would bring the kids together. Most of the girls were being held back, and we did a lot of work with the community to help them understand the importance of girls' education and to make sure that they were, behind this. And the girls would come together. Boys were included too, and the teaching assistants would work with them, and then we would use the radio to run the lesson. And then the teacher didn't have to be a fully qualified teacher; could just work to facilitate with the kids. And so we did this as a pilot program for 18 months. And we found at the end of those 18 months that those kids had a higher matriculation rate. So they passed their exams at a higher rate than the national average, which was amazing. So kids who had not been in school were catching up, mostly girls, and were passing at like extraordinary rates. And they were all, we talked to these kids. I mean, they're so excited to have this opportunity. So then when COVID struck, because then kids are duly affected by both the lockdown and the conflict, we were then approached by the Ministry of Education to see if we could expand our distance-based radio learning activities. And now, hopefully within the next year, we'll have reached 500,000 kids. And
Wow.
so those are the kinds of successes, and that's funded by the Government of Canada. And so those are the kinds of successes where it's just awe-inspiring, right? And that's not my success. I mean, that's the success of our local teams, our country directors, our office, our staff. I mean, these are extraordinary people pushing against huge odds in extreme circumstances, and defying those odds and creating a better environment for women and children. And it's amazing. It's totally inspiring. So
Yeah.
for me, that's what I rely on all the time.
Yeah, that is
That's why I get
amazing.
out of bed.
Yeah, that's incredible. What advice do you have for people who do want to make a difference in the world and don't want it to be a superficial difference?
I would say, look, if you're thinking of a career path that might be in this space, in the international humanitarian space, human rights space, that kind of thing, take your time, build your networks, volunteer locally with those organizations, help them with important things like fundraising, or if we ever get back to having events, help support them with their events. Find out what it is that you can do, as opposed to coming at them and saying, well, I'd like to go here, or I'd like to go there, or can you use me for this? Because often that's very difficult, especially for smaller to medium-sized organizations that could greatly benefit from the help and support, but don't necessarily have the resources to be able to plug you into some big, meaningful experience, right? So I would say that if you're thinking of a career in this area, start by helping out. Start a chapter in your community for the organization, or at your school, or at your university. Do some fundraising, engage in some advocacy, invest in the process of learning, understanding the work, and how you can make the most effective contribution. If you're not interested in the career path, if you're more interested in how can I just help? I said this earlier, but I'll say it again. The best way you can help is to give. And the more regular those contributions, if it is a monthly contribution, for example, that allows organizations to properly plan, it means they have more predictable budgets. It means that they can take programming decisions knowing that they have the resources available to them. And also remember that organizations do need a certain amount of overhead to do the job well. We do have to be able to manage the funds. We have to be able to provide oversight to programs. We have to be able to audit programs, all of those really, really important things. And when you're constantly shortchanging and looking at these arbitrary metrics around 10% overhead or 15% overhead or 20% overhead, I mean, there's a certain point, yes, it becomes quite obscene, but anything that's 25% or under, I often say it's better to have 75 cents on the dollar well managed than 100 cents on the dollar wasted.
That's a great point. So last question, along the way, you have, because of the great work that you're doing and the fact that other people have been inspired by it, you've gotten to meet some pretty cool people. You mentioned Gord Downey getting involved in the cause at a very early stage. I have seen pictures of you with Hollywood actors and with Hillary Clinton and people like that. So is there
I interviewed Hillary Clinton for an event here in Toronto. She was very engaging.
Yeah. So is there a moment that stands out for you that was kind of like just as a personal thing, not so much work related, but just kind of a cool moment for you?
Okay, well, you will laugh because those opportunities have been wonderful. I'm not somebody who chases those opportunities. It's just sometimes you end up at these things and then suddenly it's, oh, this is Bono. Oh, hi, nice to meet you, Bono, and all that kind of stuff. But for me, because especially growing up, books were my I mean, books were everything. Books still are everything to me. And so writers were my celebrities, right? And I remember being in the UK and going to Oxford so that I could hear Arthur Miller at do a talk and that kind of stuff. And so and I loved The Crucible and acted in The Crucible. So that was like a big rock star moment for me. But probably the biggest one for me would have been when I met Margaret Atwood. And I remember I was about 26 years old, and I was at something, and there was a buffet line. She doesn't know the story, by the way. I've met her subsequent to that, and so she has no idea that this happened to me. And so I was with my husband Eric, and I was like, oh, there's Margaret Atwood. There's Margaret Atwood. And Michael Ondaatje was there too. And I was like, and there's Michael Ondaatje, and there's Margaret Atwood, and there's Michael Ondaatje. And my mind was just blown. I'd met Bob Dylan. I'd met all these people. Nah, it was like, there's Margaret Atwood. There's Michael Ondaatje. And so then he says to me, he said, well, you should go talk to her. I was like, okay. So I had to get the courage to go talk to Margaret Atwood. And we're standing in line at this buffet. And then we had an exchange. And then I came back. And so my husband Eric says to me, he goes, did you talk to Margaret Atwood? I said, yes. He said, well, what did you say? And I said to him, I asked her if she wanted more carrots. So he's looking at me, he's like, you really have a problem. I was like, you've no idea how much of a fangirl of Margaret Atwood I am. So it's that's my nerdy moment, is meeting my literary heroes.
Your writing heroes, yeah.
Well, Salman Rushdie would be on that list as well. If I ever got to meet him, I would. I don't know if I'd ever recover. I'd never wash my hand again.
Well, I'm glad you got another chance to talk to Margaret Atwood and have a more meaningful conversation than just about the carrots.
Well, I don't know if it was meaningful for her. I basically followed her around the whole evening with a piece of paper and a pencil, writing down everything she said. I mean, she's probably afraid of me, but that would be fair.
Well, Sam, this has been so interesting and insightful and inspiring, and I'm totally in awe of the work that you do. And I'm not even sure how you do all of that. And you're still a doctor and a parent, and you have a family life. And what I admire most, I think, is just the fact that you have chosen to be very strategic about what you're doing instead of just trying to do something, good at a superficial level. So I think everybody could benefit from that lesson. So thank you for sharing all of this with us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Mark. And thank you so much for your really insightful questions. You made me think and reflect on where I'm at this moment in time, and where I've come from and where I might be going. And I don't often do that. I really appreciate it. It's been a real opportunity.
I really hope that Sam is right, that war can be solved in a lifetime. I have to say, I'm really inspired by her strategic approach in engaging people in the communities that War Child serves, rather than having it be another form of volunteerism or people from developed countries swooping in to save the day. What she does is so much more difficult and yet has so much more impact. So once again, a big thank you to Dr. Samantha Nutt, not just for joining us on Digging Deep, but for all the incredible work she does. If you enjoyed this episode, please review it and share it with others. That's going to help us produce more great episodes. And if you want to keep digging deep into topics and lessons like this, or see the show notes, or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, or read my blog where I post every day, you can do all of that at letsdigdeep.com. That's letsdigdeep.com. And get ready for more great stories and powerful lessons on the next edition of Digging Deep. Thank you for listening.